Hello, Matt. It is good to be with you again.
That's my COVID cough. I'm coming back. Day before Thanksgiving, I got COVID. So if you're wondering what the hell happened to us, I'm right here. I'm glad to see you, Jesse.
Glad to see you. I'm glad that you are 1,200 miles away and not coughing in my face.
Yeah, that's great. I can just cough back onto my family who gave it to me.
Glad that you're healthy.
Yeah, just watch out now that we got the super spreader. We're in the new phase. And so my wife just went grocery shopping and boom, we all got sick.
Yeah. Well, here we are, a new page in the calendar, a new year, and still everything must change.
Yep. Another year where humanity is already fucking up again.
Yeah. From minute one. So this conversation is a companion piece to another recording where I read this piece that was published around 2014, 2015 by CrimethInc, To Change Everything, an Anarchist Appeal, a introduction by the group to values of anarchism, their introduction to anarchist values. It was a small 48-page pamphlet. It's a website, a companion video, short 7-minute companion video co-produced with Submedia. They did a Kickstarter campaign, which I think might have been the only Kickstarter campaign that CrimethInc has done in its 2-decade-plus history, to produce 100,000 physical copies of it. So folks may have seen a physical copy of this somewhere, but totally free. Download the PDF, print it out. CrimethInc is a networked alliance of self-described ex-workers that produce myriad forms of agitprop, so books and zines and posters. And like I've got a poster up here in my studio from their book Work, that's Capitalism as a Pyramid Scheme. And I actually have been familiar with the work coming out of this collective for quite some time, back in 2005, 2006, when I ran a little
Soapbox, right?
Soapbox, a little anarchist info shop for just a year back in Bellingham, Washington. I had all of the stuff that CrimethInc produced at that time. And they also seem to be based in the Northwest, Washington and Oregon.
Olympia, where it initially started, these groups of ex-workers?
Yeah, apparently. They got a bit of attention this year during the crackdown on blaming anarchists for everything during the uprisings. So,
especially with Facebook, right? Because Facebook now is being asked, like all these other media conglomerates, to create their own censorship boards. And the right screams when Nazis are taken off Facebook, and then they go after, well, you got to take someone from the left, as if we're the same thing, as if we're supposedly radical when we're asking for humane and principled relationships with each other. So CrimethInc, I think they got their page wiped. I think they retitled it, right? Didn't they?
Yeah, they had their Facebook page removed back in August, I believe, and they have created a new one called To Change Everything. Given that this is sort of their manifesto, if you will, and recently had their Instagram account suspended. And they weren't the only ones. There were a number of other anarchist groups that had pages removed. But overall, Matt, what were your thoughts on this piece? Because I know this was the first time you read this piece.
It's a crystal clear statement of values, and it's unimpeachable as a pronouncement or manifesto of values. There's absolutely nothing for me to disagree with in terms of its formation and understanding of power and of hierarchy and of the worship of leaders, as well as our own complacency about building a new world. And I think it's a really good thing to start with for the new year, because what is the new year but constantly a harangue about your New Year's resolutions and the ways that you're supposed to change? And our changes are always being asked to be done individually, through the private heart, not through collective action. And this is something that's asking for collective action, as it does acknowledge individual rights.
Yeah, that everything needs to change. Not my individual consumption behaviors, but the whole goddamn fucking system needs to change.
This compartmentalization of our responsibilities for change is part of the neoliberal racket, right? I don't know how long this has been going on, where the New Year's resolution has been, what am I going to do for myself, rather than my community, my region, my county. It's always organized around the cult of the self. And I think this is a nice thing to look at, because it's a document that's going outside of yourself to ask and make claims to change everything through collective action.
Like I said, it is a good introduction to anarchist principles, anarchist thinking, and anarchist approach and stance and critique. And I think this potentially pairs well with an episode we did back before we were sidelined by debt, depression, and day jobs for a while. Back in 2017, the North Star of human decency. Remember that conversation? What I asserted was that anarchism is the North Star of human decency, right? It's the ideal to strive for in our relations with each other.
And it's an ethical toolkit. It's a phrase that we've used in the past, that it creates a framework on how society should function and how our relationships with each other should function.
Yeah. I think this also is a good companion piece to David Graeber's piece that we mention a lot. There's also a very short piece of a very different kind of nature, but an introduction as well to anarchist principles. His well-known piece, Are You an Anarchist? The answer might surprise you. Encourage folks to read that if you haven't yet, in addition to this piece. A few things I would say in general about this piece that I appreciate about CrimethInc's work is that it doesn't rely on a legacy of canonized theorists. This doesn't fall in the same pitfalls that Marxist sort of statements would, nor does it call on readers to defer
seminal texts.
Yeah. It doesn't require any education in some arcane history about events that happened that nobody really knows about, but they heard rumors about.
It's not telling you to read up on theory.
You're right.
Come back to me when you're properly all read up on theory and you're ready. Then I'll do the emotional labor. Right. It assumes you know these things already.
And like all of this collective's work, there's no credited individual authors. There's not relying on the renown of a public intellectual to legitimize its claims. It's offered to stand on its own. It is one thing I would say that I appreciate about this collective's work as a whole is that there are no individual credits anywhere. It's all anonymous. And I would say they've done a good job remaining anonymous relatively over 2 decades plus.
I would say it's also a game changer as a form, because if we look at anonymity, it wasn't something that was, you were considered insane to do something like this. But given that this is an organization that's been together for at least 20 years, right? At least 20 years.
Yeah. One of my initial questions about this is who's the intended audience? Because presumably is sort of an introduction to anarchist ideas to potential fellow revolutionaries, to potential sympathetic folks on the left who may not already be inhabiting anarchist ideals. So fellow folks from the wage slave class. But, well, how do I need to relate to the class that's holding me back, to the influencer class, to the managers who are standing in the way? Because it's not just me who needs to change, but they need to change, right?
And that's what's so refreshing about it. It's quite clear throughout this manifesto document that it's not just about you yourself having to change.
Right.
It says that your change should come alongside these institutional, system-wide, society-wide changes.
Yes. And I would say, yes, everything must change. We need complete social, political, and economic systems change, not a self-help revolution. We need a revolution in our material conditions and in the institutions that shape them. We need the entire culture to change, which means that those who make culture must change or get out of the fucking way.
Stop hogging the mic.
Stop hogging the mic. So we're going to go through this much like we've done many other texts, where we'll just take each prompt. This is a short piece, so it doesn't have chapters, but it does have headings, and it's very well organized into brief statements following headings. And so we're just going to follow each of those and offer some reflections. Much of my response to this is a yes and. Yes, totally agree. And
let's take it further.
Yeah, let's take it a little further. So the first thing is to change anything, start everywhere. So if you could change anything, what would you change?
We would have to start everywhere, because the violence of this system of inequity is everywhere. And that's why I like this arrangement, is it says the problem is everywhere. And so we have to start everywhere or anywhere,
right,
because of how diffuse power networks are.
Yeah.
Huge break from a Marxist notion of workerism and the boss and labor.
Right.
It's looking at hierarchy and domination throughout our society, which you could find very quickly in any step out of your doorway.
It is the air we breathe. I mean, the statement starts with, no piecemeal solution will serve. We need to rethink everything according to a different logic. So yes, everything must change. But it's not just that we need to rethink everything. We need to then redesign and then remake everything according to, so they say this a few times, right? A different logic, but they don't really spell out what this different logic
as much as it should.
But this different logic needs to be one of cooperation and shared abundance, not competition and scarcity. And I would say, well, to change anything, we need to start with systemic diagnosis and critique. Or I would borrow from Eric Olin Wright's framework for emancipatory social science. And our approach to this whole project, our cooperative intellectual endeavors, follow this kind of framework where we start with a deep systems thinking and critique. And our shorthand for this systemic diagnosis and critique is what we call the poison pyramid, the compounding systems of hierarchy, domination, and oppression, religion, capitalism, and celebrity. And yeah, like I said, there's no shortage of critique.
No shit, Karl Marx.
Yeah. Fucking capitalism is the fucking problem. No fucking
But
shit.
there are these other towering blockers like celebrity and religion that are hierarchy generating machines. And the capitalism's not the only one.
And this is also where I might start to put priority in order, right? To change anything, say we need to abolish the motherfucking cost of living.
Absolutely.
All right. So then jump into the meat of it. Start with self-determination. What limits how you can fulfill your potential?
Open the book of secrets and whisper some positive things to me so vibrations will come to me.
I recollect in my initial reading of this piece, this was one of the statements where I prickled a little bit, is in the assertion that they say the open secret is that we do all have complete self-determination.
Yeah.
Not because it's given to us, because not even the most totalitarian dictatorship can take it away. Well, sort of.
Really? I mean, yeah. How are people going to author that up? I mean, if you're working 2 jobs and you're a single mother, when you are trapped in survival, what self-determination can you enact? It should be more like there are different ranges of self-determination possible, but within the limited space that you have, can you flip that dial, right?
Right.
And you can. There's certain things we can. And what's blocking the self-determination is our free time is now largely spent streaming and staring at screens. And so there is time that we have left from our exhaustion of work where we're escaping into these different reality phantasms, Netflix and Hulu, and bragging about binge watching. There is time that we do have for pleasure, but it's getting smaller and smaller if you look at the overall lack of time people have. You look at overall hours of work, Americans are working more than ever. So the notion that you can start with self-determination as some flat-handed thing isn't really true.
If you have a trust fund and you can just escape from the burden of a day job or other sort of coercion to spend all of your time doing labor for capitalists, then maybe you have some self-determination.
Yeah, and this is the neoliberal part of the thing where it's like, should we really start with self-determination or acknowledgement that we do have the potential for self-determination, as we also should acknowledge the blockers and the different arrangements of self-determination within the matrix of work, exhaustion, and pleasure. And we choose pleasure over actively changing society because there's lots of corpses of failed left movements that were liberatory and that wanted to emancipate, but failed because there weren't enough people involved.
Yeah, another approach I might take to this assertion is, yes, agree, self-determination, but one, I would frame it in more of respect for others' self-determination.
And lack of.
And or lack of, right? And understanding of our varying degrees of determination that we can enact on our own lives. But if we're going to shift this into the mode of a demand, right, of an aim, of a goal, I would shift it towards start with the golden square. That's how we get the ability for self-determination is through material conditions for freedom.
We can enact self-determination via the decommodification of food, shelter, healthcare, and education.
Yes.
And that is where we really have self-determination that builds to greater self-determination.
Capitalism is all about denying self-determination, at least for the non-capitalist class, for the 99%. For the rest of us, it is about caging off our ability to determine what our own lives are. So capitalism is a thing standing in the way that limits our potential. So what limits how I can fulfill my potential? Capitalism does. Debt limits my potential. The motherfucking cost of living limits my potential.
And if you want something, you're going to have to start this decommodification process.
Yeah. The next section is start by answering to ourselves.
You must hold yourself up to question what you're currently doing and what you're implicated in.
This section, for me, aligns with, again, the demand of those folks standing in the way, those folks who actually have some power, the influencer class, those who actually have some influence on how our world is shaped, those who are creating culture, are standing in the way. those are the people who have
Mhm.
the highest degree of responsibility.
Oh, it's that great line. Managers and tax collectors love to talk about personal responsibility,
Yeah.
but if we took complete responsibility for all of our actions, would be following their instructions in the first place. And if we look at the shitty clusterfuck of Congress and Senate right now to not pass $2,000 survival checks,
Yeah.
to do the basic minimum,
Yeah.
why are we being asked to take care of ourselves if they can't even take care of their own fucking jobs?
Yeah, this gets to the value of responsibility and the ethics of responsibility. And
As a reciprocal notion that if I'm supposed to be responsible, are you being responsible?
exactly.
Is the
Yes.
state being responsible? Are the
Exactly.
institutions of power and celebrity being responsible to us?
Yeah.
Because they're not.
No. You see it fucking everywhere. Bosses just holding on to maintain their boss status.
Yeah.
Just want to keep being bosses. And fucking get out of the fucking way.
Absolutely.
It also recalls the quote from Ursula K. Le Guin, what is an anarchist? One who, choosing, accepts the responsibility of choice.
Once you're inspired by the values and ideas of anarchist thinking, it's something you never can really turn off.
It's also something that can't be just a personal thing.
Mhm.
It can't just be like, well, I'm free. I abide by these values, so I'm good. No, this is a thing that is about social relations.
Mhm.
And until all of us are relating in these kinds of ways through our institutions and through all our social arrangements, there's still going to be inequity, hierarchy, oppression,
Well, this
domination.
gets back to, I think, a great article I'll put in the show notes right next to the article by David Graeber, Are You an Anarchist? The answer might surprise you, is Nathan J. Robinson's The Power of Anarchist Thinking.
Yeah.
Because what happens when you start to think like an anarchist is that it not only alters and transforms you, because once again, in this section is talking about how we often take what's convenient or easy as an ethic. So like religion is a fast food ethical system.
Yeah.
It's like a fast food drive-in. Here's my way of living and you package it for me because it's so exhausting to think for myself.
Exactly.
Well, with the power of anarchist thinking, it's a compass that's always shines whether there's light in the sky or not. And when you see that light up through your own eyes, then everything around you must change because it must be in balance with what you see is a responsible system of belief and decisions.
The next section is start by seeking power, not authority.
And we could have a real good discussion on this one, right? I mean, this is something you've talked about privately with me too, is whether the problem is power itself.
Right.
Can power be something that's shaped in an egalitarian way, or does it already implicate some hierarchy of authority in that the term itself is a problem?
I mean, the assertion that they make here is that there's nothing oppressive about power per se, that
if it's collectively shared,
and that power can be liberating, right? The power to care for others, the power to have self-determination, the power to do creative work, the power to make decisions about the way our world is shaped. And that's the kind of power we need. So when we say power, we mean having influence, having a say on how our world is shaped. So now we have no fucking say. One of the sort of contradictions, perhaps, in this collective's approach is their lack of an embrace of democracy, because there's sort of an assumption of democracy as this neoliberal kind of thing. And
so we just throw it away.
Yeah, the stain of the failures of democracy over the centuries. But how we do this, how we seek power, is to democratize society.
You're right. We could think of the way that they're using power to actually just say democracy, not authority.
Yes. Seek democracy. We need to seek democracy and build dual power, autonomous networks of institutions that can enable us to have real say over how our world is shaped. And these can take the form of worker-owned co-ops, debtors, unions, involvement in politics in a way that is not dependent on money, but every person should have a say in shaping their world.
I think what's crucial in this is the way they arrange the notion of authority as these linked hierarchies of domination.
Right.
The soldier obeys the general, who answers to the president, who derives an authority from the Constitution. These, pyramids of manhood, whiteness, and property are linked, and they are circumscribed within themselves as a system of domination with an endless tail. It's a snake with no end to its tail.
I like how they characterize this here, acknowledging that they're just social constructs. In this phrase, ghosts hypnotizing humanity.
That's a great phrase, yeah.
These myths that give shape to this pyramid scheme of every part of our world are just ghosts hypnotizing humanity. Bad ideas.
Yep.
Just bad ideas. The next part is start with relationships built on trust.
Yeah, do you want to be abused? Well, and this comes back to the notion of what are the best relationships in human society. There's an
Right.
Atlantic article I'll post about this, which is that what if our societies were organized around friendship and not romance?
Right.
And
Mhm.
why is it that friendship is actually the best social arrangement in terms of interpersonal connection? Is because it requires constant egalitarian reciprocal relationships, and you're not trying to manipulate someone for sex. You're not turning them into property. I don't put a wedding ring on my best friend. And so that's something to acknowledge and think about, is that relationships built on trust
Yeah.
as a foundation
Yeah.
will create further deepening of bonds and solidarity.
Yeah, this very well could have been like relationships built on trust as opposed to authority.
That would have been a good linkage from that
Yeah.
to the prior section. This is the opposite with our relationship to authority.
I mean, I guess if you thought of this as an anarchist CSS sheet, like a cascading style sheet, they all sort of nest together, right? But yes, this is about reciprocity, about free association and mutual aid, about autonomy and respect.
And this is the thing, is if we build on this small level in terms of our civic engagement with each other, we should be seeing the grace and goodness and anarchist values on the local level that will be replicated on the superstructure above. So it's kind of like how we watch movies or books about how this family becomes a symbol of the nation state. Well, in an anarchist sense, how good are the friendships in the organization itself?
Right.
And that's what social movements do in the left really well, is they create strong, long-term social relationships.
Yeah.
And that's my concern too when you look at George Floyd uprisings versus Occupy. Occupying, you were occupying a place for a month and you formed strong social friendship networks.
Right.
Are those networks and friendships as unified and as long and as deep as at Occupy? Because the friendship is the thing. It's reciprocity and mutual aid. And if we're not seeing that at the smallest level of social unit, we're not going to build anything higher.
We can say friendship is a model of this more egalitarian kind of relation because, according to our common sense, our common conception of friendship is one that isn't a default to hierarchy.
If we look at family or romantic love, there are systems of domination. So how many times have you probably heard in a movie or book or from a friend that, yeah, I molested you, or yeah, I stole money from you, but I'm still your family?
In every other sphere, the default, the common sense, the common understanding is one of relations of hierarchy. So whether that is because of patriarchy and in the nuclear family, a system of hierarchical relations, or always in the workplace, a system of hierarchical relations, and throughout society, it's all systems of hierarchical relations, save for the arena of friendship.
Yeah.
Is the only one where the common sense is that we don't approach it with the assumption of hierarchy. Why can't we approach every realm of our social interactions without the assumption of hierarchy?
And I live my values because my son calls me fucker and fuckface. So, and I don't hit him. I don't yell at him. I'll let him emote, let it get out of his system, and I cuss at him too.
Yeah,
And,
fuck
you know,
off.
but we're not hitting each other, and we're playful. And,
Yeah.
you know, it's not like I can't take the critique.
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things too is like a good family is one that allows for the ribbing of others and their shortcomings.
The next part is start by reconciling the individual and the whole.
Hey, you know, Toy Story, the movie, all the movies are about this relationship between being a part of something,
Right.
but wanting to be a part of something. And that tension and the spelling of a part and a part, right? When it's a part of something, it's A is separated from the word part. If you're actually separated, it's one word. Shows this kind of contradiction and paradoxical notion about our desire to wanting to be an individual, but also wanting to be part of something bigger.
And in this moment of global pandemic, more than ever, we need to come together while we stay apart. And also recognizing our complete and utter interdependence of our interconnectedness, that we are all in continual relationships of mutual interdependence. And again, this would think about the analogy of the tree.
The image is a child looking up in glory at the tree, hugging it.
Society should be more like a forest, something that is interconnected, that's interdependent, that breathes to give back to the planet.
And when you walk on those forest grounds, you see the individualized natures of all these individual creatures and beings and plants, but you still feel a sense of a unified space.
There's no one outside of society. There's no escape. We're all, as I say, in this together, meaning that all of our fates are tied together.
We are part of this interconnected web of belonging.
Yeah, and this past year should have made utterly urgent and clear to each one of us that we breathe each other in.
Yeah, exactly. And that our families or the people that we live with, if you're lucky to live with someone during COVID, to have some relationship, we need more inputs and more nutrients. And I think that's one of the things I've learned from COVID, both having it and then being in solitary confinement during, Thanksgiving, early Christmas, is how we need complex inputs from many people to be healthy.
Yeah.
And that you can't rely on one person to have a healthy mind or yourself. You start to realize that you're a nutrient bed that requires all kinds of inputs.
You're a node on this complex web of life encircling this planet. The next part is start with the liberation of desire. So to be truly free, we need leverage over the processes that produce our desires. What do you think about this one?
That's what I think.
I guess the critique would be like, yes, absolutely, agree with the statement, but would I say start with? I don't know. But yes, fuck advertising. Fuck the propaganda that continually 24 hours a day is trying to colonize our minds. Fuck the advertising companies. Fuck Google and Facebook and Twitter or advertising companies. But don't blame me for the propaganda that capitalists are constantly creating. We need to blame them.
The weakness in this section is that there's two types of desires. The desires of those who dominate us and tell us that this is the desires we should have versus the desires we enact for social transformation.
The next part is start with revolt. I like this line in here. There are more conflicts within us than between us.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think that speaks to the fact that we are at war with ourselves and our own desires, that ultimately our own moral struggles with how we relate to animals and consumption and the way we treat each other and our own moments of self-destruction and self-denial. And also anxiety about knowing we're mortal beings is more than enough trauma to deal with on a daily basis.
Yeah.
Our mortality that we are fully aware of when we look deep enough down that spiritual well is we can see that there's much more battles to be taken inside of ourselves than without.
I would probably, in my own adaptation of this, reassert this as start with abolition. Not just revolt, but abolition.
Because revolt can turn into accommodation.
Right. Abolition is signaling the creation of something and specifically tearing down this order so to create a new order.
Absolutely. And abolition is the removal of the institutions that you should be revolting from.
Yes, exactly. The next section is identifying the problems.
So it's a diagnosis.
Yes, the second part is the diagnosis part. Here are the problems. First one is the problem is control.
Yeah, there's an aspect of where there's issuing out of focus because the whole thing's about hierarchy, but it talks about control and domination and borders. These are all components of a larger problem of hierarchy, which I think anarchism is central at focusing at, and why it's both a beautifully simplistic toolkit, but also it allows for so much complexity because there are so many different types and varieties of hierarchy. And so how would you categorize them and why would you separate them?
I mean, the next one is the problem is hierarchy. So it's weird that maybe it could have been reordered and maybe hierarchy, maybe you would have put first in this order because
exactly. And then break it down. Yeah.
They're all sort of related to relations of hierarchy. All of these things are symptoms of relations based on hierarchy. And so, yes, the problem is control.
But that controls the effect of the hierarchy itself, right? So this is a weaker section because, like I said, start with hierarchy. So the problem is hierarchy should be the basis for how all of these other systems of domination flow.
Right. But I would say, yes, absolutely agree. Again, problem is control. And think about what is inside the poison pyramid. All of those compounding systems of hierarchy and oppression and domination, control is common among all of them. That is part of the pyramid scheme of this world. And these institutions, I perhaps in this section would have put forth a more overt material demand towards abolition. Again, the problem is policing, and what we need to do is abolish the motherfucking police.
Not just create an awareness about it, but have a solution. And this is where you have both the diagnosis that clearly links to
What would be a
solution-based
solution?
focus.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
Offer up a solution. So I would offer up a solution in this regard about control as the most urgent, the police as a mechanism of violent control by the state. Abolish the motherfucking police.
It blocks deep democracy.
Right. Again, the next section, the problem is hierarchy. I think there's a nice phrasing here in one of the statements from this section. The existence of landlords and CEOs is no more natural, necessary, or beneficial than the existence of emperors. Hear, hear.
That's wonderful. And it shows that we've changed the titles, but they remain the same. And I would jokingly say to friends that we should just have a series of memes where we digitally put crowns on all of the billionaires. Yeah. And then that would help frame our understanding that we changed the titles, but these people are fucking kings and queens of the society.
Yeah, it's the same fucking thing.
Yanis Varoufakis says in an interview and at repeated points, and is also his new book, is that we live in techno-feudalism. So the feudal arrangement has not disappeared. It's reemerged from the old system of competing markets to one of a kind of landless peasants, digital peasants moving through the internet, giving worship tokens and consigned to developing data that they never make money from.
We always focus on capitalism as at the heart of the set of obstacles that we need to get over to start to build and design a more egalitarian world. But it's not the only thing. We could very well be in just as bad of a fucking clusterfuck with some other name system. We could imagine capitalism in a dystopian trajectory the rest of the century, morph into something else, and we have a different term for what the economic social arrangements that dominate our world are, and it's something other than capitalism. But still, if it's a set of relations based on hierarchy that dominate social arrangements, then we're in the same boat.
If it's replicating and reproducing hierarchies, then we have to talk about that, right?
These hierarchies are always rationalized and justified based purely on myths, purely on mythology, purely on false assertions. Patriarchy, religion, race, these are all schemes that justify and rationalize themselves based on false assertions, false claims on mythology. The next one is the problem is borders.
Borders are nothing more than the carved rib cage of a corpse. It's a system of violence that is turned into property.
Thinking about this, the other way to phrase all of these could have been things to abolish. We need to abolish the police. We need to abolish.
Yeah, these are the categories of hierarchy, and they could have been arranged as from the most local to the most global, but there are systems of hierarchy that have to be abolished.
We need to abolish borders. And throughout CrimethInc's work, too, you'll find this a lot. There's a piece dedicated 2017 that they did about borders. And this brings to mind, too, the tension or paradox from Astor Taylor's book, Democracy May Not Exist, but we will miss it when it's gone, that we talked about in the episode 38 discussion of the tension between inclusion and exclusion. Borders are all about who's in the in group and who's in the out group, and having a mechanism to define in group and out group.
And Taylor balked at it, as we would too, because borders, why have them? And they force us into an arrangement of we and they.
They're also a social construct that is, in practical terms, easy to eliminate.
And they manage scarcity. They perpetuate scarcity.
Right. We think about what things in practical terms would be easy to eliminate. In political terms, a whole other story, right? It can be nearly impossible given current context.
But if the golden square was global, let's say if there was a global universal basic income and there was a global requirement of states to provide the golden square, then it would be harder to keep and justify these kinds of systems of violence like borders.
I guess there's also a way we talk about borders too, as if they're purely aesthetic and not an enforcement of violence, not as a delineation of violent inclusion or exclusion, but as containers of belonging. They could be cast in a different way. Right?
And
talk about geographic belonging in the land and belonging to the land. Territoriality can have a different character.
And they're taking this border to conflate it as a system of borders that are both mediated by physical space, but also through consumption and consumer transactions. So security checkpoints, credit ratings, database, passwords, price brackets. They require surveillance. And borders require surveillance.
in every realm of our life is borders. So not just the nation state borders, but we're talking here about borders.
So before the quarantine and COVID, we still had gated communities.
The next problem, the next thing to be abolished is representation. The problem is representation. And this one here, one might think that this
is a reactionary right wing,
as in identity representation, but no, I mean representation as in representational democracy, as in representation
republic,
by the state, as in a republic. Yeah, the problem is a republic.
Well, this is where I start running into problems with the manifesto, is that, number one, the cage of the state comes in different sizes.
Right.
There's a vast gulf of difference between Bernie Sanders and the corporate supplicants like Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell, who are just cosmetic cream on top of the same decayed corpse.
Yeah.
But this is just not the case. I mean, if you look at the Republic of Norway versus the Republic of the United States, one having a system of privatized campaign funding and legalized bribery through special interest lobbying versus a system that has public financing, we could see how representation could work to increase the size of the state as a cage. And it has limits, but it's not all the same things. This is where it loses its nuance and complexities. To just say politicians always disappoint us. And so you can't reduce politicians to always being failures when you're not looking at the system itself. And so there's incentive markers that have to be identified.
I would offer up alternative in this effort of a yes and approach to this.
Does this work if you're talking about sortition?
Right. Yeah. This is where I would talk about sortition. Let's put forward something that would be a solve.
More representative. Yeah.
Delegation as opposed to representation.
Well, and it's also, it assumes that there's only one type of representation.
Right.
It assumes that there's going to be elections and that we're going to have these hooligans who are, all millionaires and take private jets and don't give a shit about us and let us die in our houses while we're being evicted. We can have different types of representation that could work to mediate these issues.
Maybe where I would be most against the grain with the overall trajectory of this group would be, we don't need to escape democracy.
No.
Quite the opposite.
Power is democracy. That's what
we need democracy. We need to democratize everything. So
we need to democratize and decommodify. And it says in its last sentence, it says, we need presence, immediacy, direct contact with each other, direct control over our lives, things no representative or representation can deliver. I'm like, well, what does that look like?
Also, too, we need to think strategically. If you think strategically in a matter of degrees, we're going to push forward. We want to push that horizon closer to real direct democracy, where each one of us has actual say in how we arrange our world. That's
and it could have posited the notion of, speaking of binary, like a binary of representation versus deliberation.
Right.
The problems of representation is we assume that if we get all of our Pokemon cards in one space, we're going to win the war. But actually, what we want is systems of deliberation.
The next one is, the problem is leaders.
Hell yeah.
Leadership is a social disorder in which the majority of participants in a group fail to take initiative or think critically about their actions. Hell yeah, you say.
Hell yeah. I mean, this is the cult of leader worship. Yeah. It's a defining hallmark of what separates anarchism from Marxism and Trotskyism and Leninism, is this complete rejection of a cult of leader worship.
Probably why in our project here we have celebrity in this as a node, as
of the poison pyramid.
Of the poison pyramid that contains all of these systems of hierarchy, domination, and oppression, but as a defining characteristic of our current pyramid scheme that we live under. The current
and one that's bizarrely not talked about enough, right? That, I mean, if you look at the entrepreneurial spirit of these left podcasts, they're all about the cult of leader worship and collecting your Twitter likes. And so it's a problem the left doesn't want to talk about.
No individual is going to save us. Falling into the cult of any leadership, the cult of personality, no matter who they are.
It's not stable as a social arrangement because it increasingly relies on one person to bail us out. And then we lose all of our own sovereign agency because that person left the room. And now that Bernie's not running for president, it's out of the race, and Biden's been selected through the corporate and media environment as the chosen manager of the world, people stop organizing, people stop moving because they expect this person to run their train.
It's not about individuals. It's about a fucking system. Everything
I mean, if we
change.
were to have people just embrace the golden square rather than Bernie Sanders, you're going to have a much more durable compass that won't rely on one person or rationalize their behavior. Because as they say, at best, depending on leaders is an Achilles heel. At worst, it reproduces the authority's interest and power structure inside those who pose them. It's better if everyone has her own agenda and a sense of her own agency. I say, no, Actually, we need a system of demands that are immutable, that are not negotiable. Food, shelter, healthcare, and education. That's what anyone that's working to decommodify those, which will further enrich other liberatory struggles, is the kind of compass we need.
No names.
No gods, no masters.
The next part, the problem is government, in which they say governments promise rights, but they can only take liberties. The idea of rights implies a central power to grant and guard them. When you think about this,
same problems I have with the section, the problem is representation. It reduces and crushes any type of complexity of thinking because it wants to go for the poetic simplicity of the haunting imperative statements. And I think it just ends up not being quite accurate because we have a variety of states and how they arrange themselves. And we can see this right now with New Zealand versus the United States in terms of how the COVID response. New Zealand's had rugby tournaments. They've had New Year's celebrations.
Yes, the state is always a cage. And yes, our utopian aim is to not have a cage. A stateless society is the utopian horizon, but that is well off. The problem isn't only in and of itself the state or government. We can be strategic in our statism or in our approach to the state.
What I call strategic statism is that we use the state when there's leverage to build outside prefigurative institutions. And you're not going to abolish the state. You're going to have to chip away at it from outside of its institutional arrangement, much like you have to chip away at capitalism very quickly. And I don't even know if we could say the word chip at it because we've got 10 years left to defeat capitalism.
Big axes for this project.
But once again, it's the problem is government, but the problem is the types of governments that we have that allow for the movement of us inside these cages.
What about democracy? Again, what about the assertion for more democracy, democratized society? This also made me think of, at the end of Astor Taylor's film, What is Democracy? And Cornel West's final poetic coda to the piece, where he says, count me in the crowd of the holy fools who demand more democracy, even though all of human history is showing the failures of our attempts and our failure to reach democracy. But nonetheless, we need to hold it as an ideal. And a stateless society, which is assumed sort of here in this statement that what we really want is outside of the cage of the state entirely. And yes, agree, but that is an ideal that is much, much, much further off than the golden square, than our immediate, necessary, doable, practical, implementable tomorrow demand of the golden square, that a stateless society is a location beyond our emancipation. That it is a utopian location in a realm of an ideal, enlightened coexistence, where first we have to learn how to just do democracy. We haven't even learned how to do that. So
it's because the government has privatized areas where there was deliberation, like union halls and worker co-ops and those sorts of things. There's less and less space to do deliberation. We don't have a tradition of deliberation in America. We're so used to listening to bosses. And then it's this thing where, well, if we have deliberation and higher rates of deliberation, we could see past this notion of a government altogether. But it doesn't erase the desire for and the need for deliberation. So once again, if we're going to get the golden square, I can guarantee you the only way we're going to get it through is fiat currency manipulation, the printing of money and flipping of digital screens. And it's not going to come from the abolishment of governments. We're not going to get the golden square. That's just not how history is going to happen. And so we have to acknowledge that the notion of a government or state should be a transitory transition.
Like you said, it can take many shapes. My knee-jerk reaction to this assertion, at least in the headline here, the problem is government, is its proximity to the quote from Reagan.
And this is where CrimethInc really dates itself as a 1990s phenomenon. It's just this fetishization of the absence of the state. And that if we all act like anarchists and start up our zines, that we are going to somehow solve this. And this is where Eric Olin writes ideas of these strategic logics. We're trying to escape the state that's not going to be good enough.
That's a nice segue to the next one, which is the problem is profit.
Hell yeah, it is profit, right? Absolutely. We're constantly being asked to sacrifice all kinds of seemingly non-negotiable rights for the right of profit.
Profit is theft, extracting more value from a thing than you put into it.
It's the ideology that supports property itself.
But the problem is capitalism, and the social construct of money is a shared hallucination.
It's both seemingly powerless and seemingly endlessly powerful. And that paradox of profit and money is at the heart of this cancerous system.
Next one, the problem is property.
Yes.
Well, what
And
the fuck would we do without
this is where
property?
profit is realized as actual construct, as an actual thing that you can own or live in or buy
Right.
or worship.
The problem is the motherfucking cost of living.
Yeah.
The motherfucking cost of living exists because there is a relation of private property and the extraction of profit, under which capitalism is arranged to produce,
Yeah.
is arranged to replicate realms of privatization and extraction.
Mm-hmm.
This again gets to the demand we keeps echoing, the decommodified life.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I would put squarely in here is the demand to cancel rent.
Mm-hmm.
So the enclosure of land is one of the primary methods or realms where private property rights are declared.
Mm-hmm.
And what are alternatives to that?
Mm-hmm.
How do we free ourselves from that? By decommodifying the land.
Yeah, and the line that speaks to this too is without money or property rights, our relationships to things would be determined by our relationships with each other.
Yes.
And how many times have we hurt other people or other people have hurt other people because property has gotten in the way?
Because of the social construct of private property.
Yeah.
Always.
The things that I would normally not do to you, like throw you out of a house, become my desire for profit. I'm going to evict you from your house during COVID because you're hurting my profit.
Yeah, and well, this is where projects like the creation of community land trusts, this is addressing this.
Yeah, because it's not for profit, which means that there are other higher order concerns about the public commons. So if you're doing something like, which I think community land trusts are the best nonprofits out there because they not only provide a service, but they also at the same time deconstruct arrangements of commodities and scarce resources. And it puts the human above the profit range.
Well, a potential methodology for decommodification of an essential need of shelter.
Yeah.
So that was the final section in the piece of the twin sections. The first, where to start, and the second section, the diagnosis of the problem.
Where to start and the problem is.
Yeah, and then in wrapping up the piece, the next section is called The Last Crime. Every order is founded on a crime against the preceding order, the crime that dissolved it.
Well, I mean, the CrimethInc, the term itself seems to reference this notion of 1984, that the thinking is the crime. Right, exactly. George Orwell, 1984. So the thinking is the crime.
Whatever it is going to be that is going to create a new paradigm, a new common sense, a new world is going to be considered, according to this world, a crime. What could be the last crime of this era to create a new world? Well, abolition. There's sprinkled throughout here abolitionist ideas.
We got to stop treating people as assets.
Yeah, but abolition, I think, would be front and center in what is the last crime. A new world is possible. How are we going to create it? Abolition is the way.
Abolition acknowledges the idea that we have to destroy institutions that everybody thinks are normal.
Yeah, we need to create new ones.
Get rid of the cops, not just defund the cops, but abolish them.
Yeah.
I'm destroying something that makes sense to other people.
And potentially creating a new deal for society, a new social contract.
Absolutely.
A radical, global, Green New Deal. A new social contract for society is going to be the last
And to
crime.
do that will require eroding capitalism.
Yeah.
It's a symbiotic. So as we build one thing out of the shell of the old, we can't just escape capitalism. We can't just opt out. We actually have to actively construct this new system.
Where we might offer more strategic analysis than the value statements here is drawing upon the work of folks like Eric Olin Wright, and the anti-capitalist work to get out of this is going to need to be one of eroding capitalism, where it's not just a project of escaping, but combining the strategic logics of anti-capitalist struggle.
In a kind of symphony and a kind of chorus.
And enacting so-called symbiotic transformations, things that can solve problems in the here and now that are feasible within the current paradigms, but that will act as gateways to transform the world, like a universal basic income.
It's a therapeutic way of thinking because the left often will divide these strategic logics in a kind of civil war.
Right.
So rather than work alongside it, saying, hey, you're part of emancipatory struggle, you're decommodifying human life, I'm not going to block your path because you're genuinely trying to support human emancipation and true freedom. We fight over those strategic logics in the civil war of the left.
To move towards the egalitarian world that we can build, the world that is possible, that is urgent, that will back us away from this cliff of impending doom of ecological collapse, is by following an anti-capitalist compass. that it's not one thing, but if we think of 4 directions that we need to be moving concurrently towards, is 1, eliminating state violence. Abolition is the way. Defund and abolish the police, prisons, military, and industrial complex. Also in guaranteeing social welfare, fighting for unconditional basic income, fighting for universal health care, Medicare for all. 3rd direction, decommodifying life. That means abolishing the motherfucking cost of living. Cancel the goddamn motherfucking rent.
So canceling student debt.
Yes.
We are making people pay for themselves before they even can pay for themselves.
These are things that can help to solve crises that capitalism has created, but that can work within. Canceling student debt in the states, day one, the next administration can do that.
And we have to democratize society. So it's not just that we have to make the republic public by democratizing politicians with public financing, by getting private money out of politics and the system of legalized bribery. We not only have to democratize our republic to actually behave like a fucking republic, but we also have to go into the private sphere itself and squat on them and have worker co-ops and consumer cooperative and land trusts. So we have to actually create and decommodify spaces outside of the civic arrangement of voting.
No more spheres of tyranny anywhere. We need to democratize everywhere. Then the wrap up is mirroring the opening of the piece. So to change everything, start anywhere. All that it takes to find each other is to begin acting according to a different logic. Again, the assertion of this different logic.
Yeah, we talked about in the very beginning of this episode that there are multiple projects that need to be done. We don't have to just do one, and we can start anywhere in our community and start looking at dismantling systems of domination.
I think it's important to be clear, too, about what this different logic is. That, yes, our aims need to include building solidarity amongst those in struggle against the tyranny of the ruling elite. We need to be working continually to build movements in this anti-capitalist direction and building dual power, building institutions where we can wield control over our own lives.
Where we're so in the face of those that are powerful and privileged that we're in their hallways as well as outside of their hallways.
Part of this is getting rid of scarcity logic. So when it comes to a different logic, this means killing the boss in your head. It means decolonizing our minds. It means replacing the false logic of hierarchy, competition, and scarcity with a material logic of interconnectedness, cooperation, and shared abundance. Because the reality is we can all have better lives. All of us, all 7.8 billion individuals on this planet can have significantly better lives.
And that interconnectedness is a through line, because interconnectedness is not just library socialism of taking what we already have and making sure that it circulates evenly in this beautiful circularity of abundance, but also that's the way the forest operates. You know, we know this now increasingly from trees that it will send food to other trees. It will tell them there's a fire. They'll communicate in this web because they know they protect each other.
We can heal each other, our past harms and our harm to the planet, but we have to redesign the world. So yes, everything must change.
This is, I think, the difference between the typical New Year's resolution bullshit and the thing that this is making is that we're only going to heal ourselves if we heal ourselves together. And that this idea of my individually working on myself like a little consumer project is not going to be good enough. That we're going to be healed through collective action.
We all have to change. The whole fucking thing has to change.
It's not only honoring the ancestors who struggled behind us, the civil rights movement, the queer rights movement, the social movements that I didn't exist in, but also it's a gift to the descendants that my struggles are as part of this through line towards human liberation, that what's been built from behind me is something I have to extend to the future.
In wrapping up, I would say that, yes, again, totally stand in accord and solidarity with these value statements. Like you said, unimpeachable set of value statements. They do have many other pieces, one of which I'd highlight was published in November, just before the U.S. elections, called What Would an Anarchist Program Look Like? A group of members from the collective outline potential sort of shape of an anarchist program, if you will. That includes decommodification of housing, food, healthcare, and education, along with abolition and reparations and decommodification of land and reorganization of safety and conflict resolution and transformative justice and so forth. So I would pair the reading of this piece with that. But overall, I would say, why not be specific, be clear about your material demands, and why aren't we saying the golden fucking square?
It's kind of fascinating because it's mimicking the problems of Occupy, which is, and this is why Mike Davis, when he criticized Occupy, it's actually wasn't radical enough, because to be radical requires making demands, whether vis-a-vis direct action, like the Tacoma Housing Group that actually occupied a travel lodge that was empty and is putting the homeless in it and just saying, let's see what you're going to do. You're going to throw homeless people out of here? Because now this is being used for a purpose. So direct action is a kind of agreement or accord with actually making material demands. So that's where we talk about the golden square all the time, because that is a material demand.
And that is how we fucking do socialism.
It's a shorthand for what socialism is. Is, do you think all people have the right to food, shelter, healthcare, and education? If you do think that, then you are a socialist.
There's no way to do this without changing everything. There's no way to build and guarantee the golden square globally without everything fucking changing.
The golden square operates with a specificity, but also a simplicity. It's somewhere in between. It's not just saying, here's a giant label that you're going to freak out about, socialism, but here's a series of material demands that we all desire for ourselves and that we should reciprocate to others as rights.
Because the reality is, this is a short timeline we're on.
Terrifying, tyrannical timeline.
It is eco-socialism or potential extinction.
Now the year has dropped. We now have even less time than the 10-year window. With 2021, 2030, we have a terrifying climate window to work with.
Beating that drum. Food, shelter, healthcare
and education.
For everyone. Every fucking one of us. And who will do it? I'll do it. You'll do it. We'll all do it.
We'll do it, right? Not some privatized, individualized, compartmentalized packet of creamer for my coffee, to borrow the line from Fight Club. I'm my little private consumer package.
Well, thanks a lot for engaging in this discussion today.
Cheers.
Cheers.